Good morning, dear students. A warm welcome to a new video on planning. Now, planning is deciding in advance what is to be done, how it is to be done, when it is to be done, and who is to do it. So, what do we understand from this? Planning refers to the determination of a course of action to achieve the desired result. Planning is an intellect process of thinking before doing. Planning bridges the gap between where we are and where we want to go. Bridge is also called as planning. Now let us look into some definitions of planning. Henry Fayol says planning is deciding the best alternative among others to perform different managerial operations in order to achieve the predetermined goal. Now let's move to the second definition. Planning is deciding in advance what is to be done. It involves the selection of objectives, policies, procedures, and programs from among alternatives. Now, let us talk about the importance of planning. The first point talks about providing direction. Now let me elaborate. Planning is concerned with predetermined course of action. It provides the directions to the efforts of employees. Planning makes clear what employees have to do and how they want to do it. Let's move on to the second point, which talks about reducing uncertainty. Organizations have to face many uncertainties and unexpected situations every day. Planning helps the managers to face the uncertainty because planners try to foresee the future by making some assumptions regarding future, keeping in mind their past experiences and scanning of business environment. The plans are made to overcome such uncertainties. Now let's move on to the third point, which talks about reducing overlapping. The organizational plans are prepared keeping in mind the requirement of all the departments. The department plans are derived from main organizational plan. As a result, there will be coordination in different departments. On the other hand, if managers, non-managers, and all the employees are following courses of action according to plan, then there will be integration in the activities. Plans ensure clarity of thoughts and action, and work can be carried out smoothly. Now, let's move on to the next point, which talks about promoting innovation. And how does that happen? Planning requires high thinking, and it is an intellectual process. So, there is a great scope of finding better ideas, better methods, and better procedures to perform a particular job. Planning process forces managers to think differently and assume the future conditions. So it makes the managers innovative and creative. Now let's move on to the fifth point, which talks about facilitate decision making. And let's see how does that happen. Planning helps the managers to take various decisions. As in planning, goals are set in advance and predictions are made for future. These predictions and goals help the managers to take fast decisions. Now let's move on to the last point, which talks about standards, setting standards for controlling. And how does that happen? Controlling means comparison between planned and actual output. If there is a variation between both, then find out the reason for such deviations and take measures to match the actual output with the plan. But in case there is no planned output, then controlling manager will have no base to compare whether the actual output is adequate or not. Now in this slide, we are going to talk about features of planning. So let us start with the first point where it says planning is goal oriented. How do we explain that? Planning starts with the determination of objectives. We cannot think of planning in absence of objective. After setting up the objectives, planning decides the methods, procedures, and steps to be taken for achievement of the set objectives. Let's move to the second point, which says planning is primary function. And what does that mean? Planning is the primary or first function to be performed by every manager. No other function can be executed by the manager without performing planning function, because objectives are set up in planning and other functions depending on the objectives only. Now let's move on to the third point, which says planning is pervasive. And what do we understand from this? It means planning is required at all the levels of the management and in all types of organization. It is not a function that is restricted only to top level managers, but planning is done by managers at every level. Formation of major plan and framing of overall policies is the task of top level managers, whereas departmental managers form plan for their respective departments and lower level managers make plan to support the overall objectives and to carry on day-to-day activities. Let's move on to the fourth point, which says planning is continuous. Now, how do you explain? Planning is a never-ending or continuous process because after making plans also one has to be in touch with the changes in changing environment and in the selection of one best way. So after making plans also, planners keep making changes in the plan according to the requirement of the organization. Now, the fifth point says that planning is futuristic. Now, what do we understand from this? It means planning always is looking ahead, or planning is a futuristic function. Planning is never done for the past. All the managers try to make predictions and assumptions for future, and these predictions are made on the basis of the past experience of the manager and with regular and intelligent scanning of the general environment. Now let's move on to the next point, which says Planning involves decision making. Now let us elaborate on this point. The planning function is needed only when different alternatives are available and we have to select most suitable alternative. We cannot imagine planning in absence of choice because in planning function, managers evaluate various alternatives and select the most appropriate one. Now, let's move on to the next point, and this talks about planning is a mental exercise. What do we understand from this? It is a mental exercise because planning is a mental process which requires higher thinking. That is why it is kept separate from operational activities. In planning, assumptions and predictions regarding future are made by scanning the environment properly. This activity requires higher level of intelligence. Now let us look into this slide which talks about limitations of planning, and limitations are of two types. One is internal and the other is external. So let us focus on the internal limitations of planning. And the first point says planning leads to rigidity. Now what does that mean? Once plans are made to decide the future course of action, the managers may not be in a position to change them. Following pre-decided plan when circumstances are changed may not bring positive result for the organization. This kind of rigidity in plan may create difficulties. Let's move on to the second point, which says that planning is a time-consuming process. Now, how do we explain this? Planning process is time-consuming process because it takes long time to evaluate the alternatives and select the best one. Lot of time is needed in developing planning premises. Let's move on to the next point, which says planning is expensive. So how do we explain this? Planning process involves lot of cost because it is an intellectual process and companies need to hire the professional experts to carry on this process. Along with the salary of these experts, the company has to spend lot of time and money to collect accurate facts and figures. Now let's move on to the next point, which talks of lack of reliable data. The data available with the organizations keep changing because of change in the business environment, and sometimes the organization does not update the data available. This data may be old and outdated. Therefore, it may not be useful to the organization. Let's move on to the fifth point, which talks about may not work in dynamic environment. Business environment is very dynamic as there are continuous changes taking place in economic, political and legal environment. Therefore, it becomes very difficult to forecast these future changes. Plans may fail if the changes are very frequent. Now, let us talk about the next point, which says planning does not guarantee success. Now, how do we explain this point? Sometimes managers have false sense of security that plans have worked successfully in past, so they will be working in future also, which is not true. There is a tendency in managers to rely on pre-tested plans. It is not true that if a plan has worked successfully in the past, it will bring success in future. Also, there are so many unknown factors which may lead to failure of plan in future. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Here, we will talk about the external factors affecting planning. And under these, we have natural calamities such as flood, earthquake, famine, which are beyond the control of managers. Second is technological changes. This reduces effectiveness of planning because when new technology is introduced, an organization has to face several problems such as higher cost of production due to obsolete technology, poor competitive position in the market, and higher capital expenditure to replace the obsolete technology. Now, the third point talks about changes in government policies such as industrial policy, taxation policy, bank rate of interest, etc., upset forecast and plans. The fourth point talks about strategy of competitors. Example, when a competitor introduces improved model of existing product, the demand and sales of a firm's product may decline. The last point talks about changes in fashion. Taste and preferences of consumers may affect the sales forecast of a firm. Thank you, children, for being patient. I will catch you up in a new video on types of plans.